The question came out softly in a garage that smelled like oil and years of masculine certainty. Is this engine supposed to burn water vapor? For half a second, the room went silent. Then the laughter started. Deep, mocking, the kind that makes you wish you'd never opened your mouth. They called him names, made him entertainment, treated his curiosity like it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard. But Marcus Williams wasn't stupid. He was 13 years old with grease under his fingernails and a mind that worked in ways none of these grown men could understand. The mechanics thought they were laughing at an ignorant kid. They had no idea they were mocking the son of the man who designed the very engine they couldn't fix. And they definitely didn't know that the quiet boy in the corner was about to expose a conspiracy so massive it would shake the entire energy industry. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The morning air in the industrial district carried the smell of diesel exhaust and cold metal. Mitchell's Auto Works sat at the edge of the shipping zone, a massive warehouse with rolling bay doors tall enough to swallow delivery trucks whole. Inside, the concrete floor was stained with decades of oil, hydraulic fluid, and the kind of grime that never really washed away. Heavy machinery crowded every corner. Engine blocks hung from chain hoists like sleeping giants. Welding sparks occasionally lit up the darker sections where men worked on frames too large to move. In the middle of all this noise and metal and masculinity stood a boy who didn't belong. His name was Marcus Williams, and he was 13 years old, skinny in a way that suggested he'd grown faster than his meals could keep up with. His hands were already black with grease despite the early hour, sleeves rolled up past his elbows on a shirt 2 sizes too big. While the men around him joked and cursed and threw tools across workbenches, Marcus stayed quiet. He watched. He studied. He absorbed everything like a sponge, soaking up water it was never supposed to touch. He wasn't supposed to be here at all, really. Not officially. The shop didn't hire kids, and they certainly didn't run some kind of youth apprenticeship program. Marcus was here because his mother, Diana Williams, cleaned offices 3 buildings down in the same industrial park. She started her shifts at 5 in the morning and didn't finish until nearly dinner time. Leaving a teenage boy alone for 12 hours a day in their neighborhood wasn't an option she was willing to take. So she'd begged actually, asked the foreman at Mitchell's if her son could just sit in the corner after school. Stay out of the way. Do his homework. Be somewhere safe. The foreman, a thick-shouldered man named Roy Brennan with a gray beard and perpetual coffee breath, had agreed under one condition. The boy didn't touch anything important. He could sweep if he wanted, organize bolts, clean tools. But the real work? That was for real mechanics. Marcus had agreed to those terms 6 months ago. He'd kept his word, technically. He didn't touch anything important. He just watched the important things closer than anyone realized. The payment for his presence wasn't a paycheck. It was leftovers from a lunch truck that stopped by at noon. It was scrap parts the shop was going to throw away anyhow. It was permission to exist in a space where he could learn things no classroom in his underfunded school district would ever teach him. And Marcus learned. First, he learned that Tommy Preston, the loudest mechanic on the floor, always overtorqued his bolts and blamed the parts when things cracked. He learned that the hydraulic lift in Bay 3 had a slow leak everyone ignored until it failed at the worst possible moment. He learned which men actually knew what they were doing and which ones just made noise to cover up confusion. But more than anything, Marcus learned about the engine. The engine that nobody could fix. It had arrived 5 weeks ago on a flatbed trailer, covered in a gray tarp and secured with more straps than seemed necessary. The delivery crew wouldn't say who sent it, just that it was a private contract job, and the shop had been paid in advance to make it run. No detail work, no cosmetic care, just make the thing operational. It was massive, custom-built. The casing alone had to weigh 400 pounds, and the internal components were like nothing most of the crew had seen outside of industrial farming equipment or marine engines. It didn't look like something that belonged in a car. It looked like something that powered a generator for a small town. Roy assigned it to his 2 best men, Carter Wells, a veteran mechanic who'd been working engines since before Marcus was born, and Jamie Brooks, a younger guy who'd done time at a dealership and talked constantly about his certifications. They couldn't figure it out. The engine would start. It would turn over, rumble to life, sound almost normal for 30 seconds. Then the temperature would spike. The pressure gauge would swing wildly. Something inside would seize or knock or scream, and they'd have to kill it before the whole thing grenaded itself across the bay. They tried everything. New gaskets, different fluids, timing adjustments, fuel mixture changes. They pulled the heads, checked the cylinders, replaced sensors, recalibrated the computer system that was supposed to manage it. Nothing worked. After 3 weeks of failure, the crew started calling it the dead block. A joke at first, then a resignation. The thing was cursed, broken, a waste of time. But Marcus didn't think it was broken. He thought it was misunderstood. He started staying late, later than he was supposed to. His mother worked until 6, but Marcus began telling her he'd wait inside until she finished. What he actually did was crouch near the dead block, hidden behind a tool cart, and watch. He watched the way vapor came out of the exhaust during the brief moments it ran. Too much vapor. Wrong color. He watched how certain chambers heated unevenly, how the cooling system seemed to fight against itself. He noticed residue around the intake valves that wasn't oil, wasn't standard fuel residue, wasn't anything he recognized from normal combustion. He started sketching. In a notebook he'd pulled from a school trash can, one with only half the pages missing, Marcus began drawing diagrams. Not artistic drawings, technical ones. He labeled parts, drew arrows, made notes about pressure differentials and vapor density. He wrote down questions he didn't have answers to yet. Questions like, why would an engine be built with a secondary chamber that didn't connect to the fuel line? Questions like, what kind of exhaust system separated vapor into 2 different outlets? And one night, while everyone else had gone home and Marcus sat alone with a dying flashlight and his notebook, he wrote the question that would change everything. Is this engine designed to burn something other than gasoline? The next day, during a test run, Marcus made the mistake of asking it out loud. Carter and Jamie were elbow deep in the engine, trying a new configuration of the timing belt. Roy stood nearby with his arms crossed, watching with the expression of a man who'd already spent too much money on something he didn't understand. 3 other mechanics were gathered around, offering opinions nobody asked for. The engine turned over, rumbled, began to heat up in that same dangerous way it always did. Marcus was supposed to be in the break room. Instead, he was standing just close enough to see, holding a rag he'd been using to wipe down wrenches. He didn't mean to say it loudly. It just came out. Is this engine supposed to burn water vapor? The noise in the bay didn't stop immediately. The engine was too loud for that. But the men stopped moving. One by one, they turned to look at him. Carter was the first to laugh. A short, sharp bark of amusement. Then Jamie joined in, and then the others. And within seconds the entire bay was roaring with laughter that echoed off the metal walls. Water vapor, Tommy Preston howled, slapping his thigh. You hear this, kid? What's next? Another mechanic shouted. Runs on moonlight. Roy didn't laugh, but his mouth twitched in a way that was almost worse, like he was embarrassed on Marcus's behalf. Boy, Roy said slowly, engines burn fuel. Gasoline, diesel, maybe propane if you're weird about it. They don't burn water. Water's what you use to cool them down so they don't melt. Marcus felt his face grow hot. He looked down at the rag in his hands, suddenly aware of how small he was. How a place. I just thought, he started. You thought wrong. Carter interrupted, not unkindly, but not gently either. Stick to cleaning, Marcus. Leave the engineering to people who know what they're doing. The laughter continued as they went back to work. But it didn't stop there. Over the next week, the jokes became routine. Expected. A game the men played whenever they needed entertainment. Hey, Marcus. Tommy would shout across the bay. You got any water? I need to fuel up my truck. When Marcus walked past with a broom, someone would make a hissing sound like steam escaping. They started calling him names. Aquaman, Professor Agao, the water boy. One guy brought in a toy boat and put on the workbench where Marcus usually sat, along with a sign that said Marcus's Research Lab. Jamie, whom Marcus had actually thought was decent, started doing a high-pitched voice whenever Marcus was nearby. Does this run on water? Does this? How about this? He'd point at random objects. A coffee pot, a forklift, a A sandwich. Everyone thought it was hilarious. Marcus stopped talking. He stopped asking questions. He kept his head down and his mouth shut and tried to become invisible. But he didn't stop watching, and he didn't stop thinking. At night, walking home with his mother through streets that smelled like garbage and fried food, Marcus kept his hands in his pockets so she wouldn't see them shake. Diana talked about her day, about the offices she'd cleaned, about a woman on the bus who tried to sell her jewelry that was obviously fake. Marcus said nothing about the jokes, nothing about the names, nothing about how small he felt in a building full of men who thought he was stupid. Instead, when they got home to their tiny apartment on the third floor of a building with broken elevator lights, Marcus went to his room and closed the door. His bedroom was smaller than the bay where the dead block lived, but it was his. Every inch of wall space was covered. Taped up pages from old textbooks he'd found in school dumpsters. Printed diagrams from the library's computer that he'd saved to a USB drive. Handwritten formulas copied from YouTube videos about thermodynamics and combustion engines. On a cramped desk made from a folding table, Marcus had built his own projects. Small engines constructed from computer fans, aquarium pumps, and pieces of broken electronics. He'd made a tiny piston system out of syringes and copper wire. He'd wired a cracked phone battery to a motor salvage from a toy car and gotten it to spin for 40 minutes straight. None of it was professional. None of it was pretty, but all of it worked. And in the corner of his closet, hidden under a jacket he'd outgrown, was a locked metal box. Marcus pulled it out. The key hung on a shoestring around his neck, tucked under his shirt where no one could see. He unlocked the box and looked inside at the things his mother didn't know he'd kept. Newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. Articles about experimental engine designs and corporate lawsuits. About a man named Dr. Raymond Williams who tried to patent something the article called a revolutionary combustion system before the whole thing disappeared into legal battles. There was a photograph, too, creased and faded. A younger man standing beside a prototype engine in what looked like a garage. He was smiling, one hand resting on the metal casing like it was something precious. The man in the photo had the same last name as Marcus. The same eyes, too. Marcus had never met his father. Raymond Williams had died when Marcus was 2 years old. Heart attack, his mother said. Stress, she'd explained, when he was old enough to ask why. But Marcus had found these clippings in a box his mother thought she'd thrown away. He'd read them dozens of times. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough to know his father had built something people were afraid of, something that powerful people wanted to disappear. Marcus closed the box, locked it, hid again. Then he opened his notebook to a fresh page and began writing everything he'd observed about the dead block. Every detail, every measurement he'd memorized, every strange behavior. He wrote until his hand cramped, until his mother knocked and told him to get ready for bed, until the questions in his head finally quieted enough to let him sleep. The next afternoon, the shop was nearly empty. Most of the crew had gone to lunch at the diner 2 blocks over, the one that served hot sandwiches and watery coffee. Roy was in his office doing paperwork, his door closed, his attention buried in invoices and work orders that were already overdue. Only one mechanic remained in the main bay, a quiet guy named Pete who was working on a completely different project in Bay 1, something involving a tractor transmission that had nothing to do with the dead block. Marcus stood near the water cooler, watching, waiting. His palms were sweating. His throat felt tight. He knew this was his chance. Maybe his only chance. The dead block sat in bay, for like a monument to failure. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across its surface. Tool marks scarred the casing where frustrated mechanics had pried and prodded. A fine layer of metal dust covered everything, residue from the grinding and filing and desperate attempts to make something work that refused to cooperate. Marcus saw his chance. He approached the dead block slowly, like it might wake up and notice him. Each step felt deliberate, dangerous. His heart hammered his chest so hard he wondered if Pete could hear it across the bay. This was against the rules. This was exactly what Roy had told him not to do. This was the one boundary he'd been warned never to cross. But Marcus couldn't help it. He had to know. He touched the engine casing, still warm from the last test run hours ago. The metal held heat like a memory. He leaned close to the exhaust port and breathed in carefully. Metal. Heat. Something else underneath. Something almost sweet, like ozone after a lightning strike, like the air right before rain. He grabbed a flashlight from a nearby bench, one of those heavy rubber-coated ones that always had weak batteries, and shone it into the intake manifold. The beam cut through shadow and revealed things the naked eye couldn't catch. He looked at the residue coating the inside walls of the manifold. It wasn't carbon buildup, not the black crusty stuff you'd normally see from incomplete combustion. It was crystalline, almost translucent, reflective, like tiny fragments of glass catching the light. Marcus's hands moved without conscious permission, driven by curiosity stronger than common sense. He found a filter access panel on the side of the block, one he'd watched Carter open at least a dozen times during their failed repair attempts. He unscrewed it carefully, quietly, his ears alert for any sound that might mean someone was coming. The panel came free with a soft metallic whisper. He pulled the filter assembly free and held it up to the light. It was clogged, completely saturated, but not with dirt or oil or any of the normal contaminants you'd find in an engine filter. With something that looked like salt, white, crystalline, dense. His mind raced through possibilities. Salt formation, mineral deposits, electrolysis byproduct, the kind of residue you'd get from breaking water molecules apart and recombining them at high temperatures. Marcus pulled a small wrench from his pocket, one he'd borrowed weeks ago and kept hidden in his backpack. He reached into the chamber behind where the filter had been and felt along the edges with his fingers. There, a panel that wasn't quite flush with the surrounding metal, a seam that didn't match the factory design, too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be a manufacturing flaw. He applied gentle pressure. Something clicked deep inside the mechanism. The panel shifted a quarter inch. Behind it, Marcus saw what he'd suspected existed, but couldn't prove until now. A secondary pathway. A channel that led from the main combustion chamber into a smaller vessel, maybe the size of a coffee can, lined with what looked like catalyst mesh. The kind of mesh you'd use for chemical reactions, for breaking molecular bonds, for separating compounds into their base elements. He didn't adjust much. He was too smart to go making wild changes to something this complex. Just loosened one valve connector that looked too tight, like someone had over-torqued it trying to stop a leak that was never about leakage at all. Rotated a pressure regulator a half-turn counterclockwise, bringing it back to what the wear pattern suggested was its original setting. Then he reassembled everything exactly as he'd found it, working backward through his steps like rewinding a video. Filter back in. Panel screwed down. Access cover replaced. As he stepped back and wiped his hands on his jeans, the engine made a sound. Not the grinding, angry sounds it usually made. This was different. A single metallic click, sharp and clear, like a lock falling into place. Marcus froze. The engine sat silent. Dead. But something about it felt different now. Aligned. He grabbed his rag and hurried back toward the break room. Heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack a rib. He didn't know if what he'd done would help. But he knew he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. 2 days later, Carter and Jamie decided to try the engine again. They'd ordered a new part, something expensive that Roy had complained about approving, muttering about budgets and contract limits and how this whole job was becoming more trouble than it was worth. The part had arrived that morning in a foam-lined box with hazard labels and handling instructions, something related to the fuel injection system, though Marcus couldn't see exactly what from where he stood. The whole crew gathered to watch, partly out of curiosity, partly out of boredom, partly because watching the dead block fail had become a kind of ritual entertainment. There was almost a festival atmosphere to it. Someone had brought donuts. Tommy was taking bets on how long it would run before something catastrophic happened. Marcus stood in the back, near the parts shelves, trying to be invisible, trying not to think about what he'd done, trying not to imagine what would happen if they figured it out. Roy gave the signal, a simple nod of his head. Jamie turned the key. The starter motor engaged with its familiar grinding whine. The engine turned over once, twice, caught, and for the first time since it had arrived at Mitchell's Auto Works on that flatbed trailer 5 weeks ago, it didn't immediately start destroying itself. The rumble was different. lower in pitch, smoother, like gravel being poured instead of rocks being thrown. The vibration that usually shook the floor felt more controlled, more purposeful. The pressure gauge climbed steadily instead of spiking into the danger zone. The temperature reading stayed in the normal range for 10 seconds. 20, 30. Carter's face shifted from skepticism to confusion, his thick eyebrows drawing together. What the hell? 40 seconds. 50. The engine kept running. The sound it made was almost pleasant, mechanical poetry, the rhythm of components working in harmony instead of fighting each other. Then something in the fuel system triggered a safety shutoff protocol, and the engine died. But it died cleanly. No ceasing, no smoke, no screaming metal, no emergency coolant spray. Just a smooth wind down into silence. The bay went completely quiet. Even the radio someone always kept playing in the corner seemed to have stopped. Run it again, Roy said. His voice was carefully neutral, the tone of a man trying not to get his hopes up. They did. Same result. Smooth operation for almost a minute, maybe 55 seconds this time, before the automatic shutoff kicked in again. But that was program behavior, not a failure. The difference was everything. What did you do different? Roy asked. Carter shook his head. Nothing. Same setup as last time. Jamie checked his notes. Same timing. Same fuel mixture. Same everything. But it wasn't the same. Everyone could hear it. Marcus, standing behind a tool chest, wrote furiously in his notebook. He sketched the vapor pathway he'd seen, drew arrows showing how pressure should flow through the secondary chamber, wrote calculations for hydrogen separation rates and catalyst activation temperatures. He didn't notice Tommy Preston walking up behind him until the man's shadow fell across the page. What you got there, Professor? Marcus tried to close the notebook. Tommy was faster. He snatched it out of Marcus's hands and held it high, grinning. Let's see what the genius is working on, Tommy announced to the bay. Several men looked over, smiling already. Tommy opened the notebook, started reading aloud in a mocking voice. Secondary vapor compression chamber. Catalytic hydrogen separation. Thermal regulation through. He stopped, squinted at the page. What the hell is this? He flipped through more pages. The smile faded slightly. These are actual diagrams, Tommy said, sounding less certain. Let me see that, Carter said, walking over. Carter took the notebook, studied it quietly. His expression changed. Where did you copy this from, Marcus? I didn't copy it, Marcus said quietly. I drew it. From what reference? From watching. Carter flipped through more pages. Detailed sketches of the dead block's interior. Measurements. Pressure calculations. Some of it was wrong, sure, but some of it was advanced. Very advanced. Kid, Carter said slowly. Do you actually understand what you drew here? Marcus hesitated, then nodded. Carter showed the notebook to Jamie. They exchanged a look. This is the dead block's layout, Jamie said. How did you? I watched you work on it, Marcus said. I remembered. Roy walked over to see what the commotion was about. He took the notebook. Read silently. His jaw tightened. Marcus, Roy said, did you touch that engine? The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus considered lying, considered running, considered a dozen different answers. He went with the truth. Yes, sir. The bay went completely silent. When? 2 days ago, during lunch. Roy's face darkened. I specifically told you. I know, Marcus interrupted. I am sorry, but it was wrong. The configuration was wrong. You were feeding fuel into a chamber that wasn't designed to burn fuel directly. And you know this how? Roy demanded. Marcus took a breath. Because that chamber is supposed to break down water vapor into hydrogen and oxygen using a catalyst mesh. The hydrogen burns. The oxygen regulates temperature. That's why you kept overheating. You were forcing combustion in the wrong sequence. Every man in the bay stared at him. That's not possible, Jamie said. Engines don't work that way. This one does, Marcus said quietly. Carter made a sound between a laugh and a cough. Kid, that's theoretical technology. Hydrogen separation combustion. There are labs trying to figure that out. You're telling me this engine. I'm telling you what I saw, Marcus said. There's a secondary pathway, a catalyst chamber. Vapor separation ports. It's all there. You just weren't looking for it. Because it's insane, Tommy muttered. But Roy wasn't laughing. He was staring at Marcus like he'd never really seen him before. The engine ran better after you touched it, Roy said slowly. Marcus said nothing. An older mechanic named Dale Harrison, who usually kept to himself, spoke up from the corner. That layout he drew. The vapor separation design. I've seen something like that before. Everyone turned. When? Roy asked. Dale scratched his gray stubble. Long time ago. Maybe 15 years. There was a case. Some independent engineer tried to patent a hydrogen assist engine. Got real close to production. Then there was a lawsuit. Corporate thing. Whole project got buried. The air in the bay felt suddenly colder. What happened to the engineer? Carter asked. Dale shrugged. Don't know. Think he died. But I remember thinking the design was brilliant. Too brilliant. Made a lot of people nervous. Marcus felt like the floor had tilted under his feet. Why would it make people nervous? Jamie asked. Because, Dale said quietly, if an engine like that worked, if you could really run combustion on separated water vapor, you'd change the entire fuel industry. Make a lot of powerful people very unhappy. Roy looked at Marcus again, then at the dead block, then back at Marcus. Everyone take 5, Roy said suddenly. I need to make a call. The crew dispersed slowly, throwing glances at Marcus as they left. Dale walked over and pulled Marcus aside. His voice was low. Kid, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop. Right now. I was just trying to help. Marcus said. I know, but engines like that, technologies like that, companies have killed projects over less. People lost jobs, lost reputations. Dale's eyes were serious. Some lost more than that. I don't understand. You don't need to understand. You need to keep your head down and your mouth shut. Whatever you figured out, forget it. Dale walked away before Marcus could respond. In his office, Roy picked up the phone with a hand that trembled slightly. He had a private number, one he'd been given when the engine first arrived, written on a business card with no company name, just digits. He'd been told to call if there were any problems, or any progress, or anything unusual. He dialed, waited through 3 rings. A voice answered. Smooth. Professional. Yes. This is Mitchell's Auto Works, Roy said. I'm calling about the engine. What's the status? It's running. Partially. Better than before. Silence on the other end. Then what changed? Roy hesitated. Someone made an adjustment. One of your mechanics? Not exactly. Who? Roy looked through his office window at Marcus, who sat alone on a bench, staring at his hands. A kid, Roy said. Just a kid who's been hanging around. Another pause. Longer this time. Don't let him leave, the voice said. I'm coming personally. The line went dead. Roy set the phone down slowly. His hand was shaking visibly. Outside, Marcus felt every eye in the shop watching him. The jokes had stopped. The laughter was gone. Something had changed. Something bigger than an engine running smoothly. And Marcus, sitting in that dirty garage with grease under his fingernails and his father's ghost in his bones, had no idea that the man who owned the engine was already on his way, or that when he arrived, everything Marcus thought he knew about his life was about to shatter. The workshop buzzed with whispered conversation for the rest of the afternoon, but Marcus barely heard them. He sat on his usual bench in the break room, staring at his hands without really seeing them. The grease under his fingernails suddenly felt heavier, more permanent, like evidence of a crime he couldn't wash away. When his mother arrived to pick him up that evening, her face was different, tight, worried. She didn't greet the men like she usually did, didn't smile or make small talk. She just walked straight to Marcus and said, We're leaving. Now. In the parking lot, Diana unlocked their old sedan, a 15-year-old Toyota with a dented bumper. Marcus climbed in without a word. They drove in silence through streets crowded with evening traffic, past strip malls and fast food restaurants. Finally, Diana spoke. Her voice was measured, careful, like she was picking each word with tweezers. Roy called me at work today. Marcus's stomach dropped. Mom, He said you touched something you weren't supposed to touch. Something important. Something expensive. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles going pale. Marcus, what did you do? I fixed it, Marcus said quietly. The engine they couldn't fix. I figured out what was wrong with it. Diana's jaw clenched. That's not your job. Your job was to sit quietly, do your homework, and stay out of the way. That was the agreement. I know, but no buts. Her voice cracked slightly. Do you have any idea how hard I worked to get Roy to let you stay there? How much I begged? How many times I promised him you wouldn't be a problem? Shame washed over Marcus like cold water. I am sorry. They pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex, a 3-story building with peeling paint. Diana turned off the engine, but didn't get out. She just sat there, staring ahead. What kind of engine was it? She asked. Marcus hesitated. Custom. Experimental. It had this secondary combustion system that nobody there understood. They kept trying to run it like a normal engine, but it's not normal. It's designed to separate water vapor into hydrogen and oxygen, then burn the hydrogen while using the oxygen to regulate temperature. And Diana's head whipped toward him. What did you just say? It's a hydrogen assist system. Vapor compression with catalytic. Stop. Diana's voice was barely a whisper. Stop talking. Marcus went quiet. His mother's face had gone pale, her eyes wide and distant, like she was seeing something that wasn't in the car with them. Mom! She didn't answer. Instead, she opened her door and got out. Marcus followed her up the concrete stairs to their third-floor apartment, watching the way her shoulders hunched forward like she was carrying something heavy and invisible. Inside the apartment, Diana went straight to the hallway closet. She pushed aside winter coats and old shoes. In the back, behind a broken vacuum cleaner, was a cardboard box sealed with yellowed packing tape. Marcus had never seen this box before. Diana brought it to the kitchen table and stood there, looking at it like it might explode. Her hands trembled as she reached for the tape. Mom, what is that? Sit down, she said. Marcus sat. Diana peeled the tape away slowly, the sound loud in the quiet apartment. She opened the box and pulled out things Marcus recognized immediately. More newspaper clippings, crisp and carefully preserved. Patent documents in plastic sleeves. Technical drawings on grid paper. Photographs of engines that looked almost identical to the dead block at Mitchell's. And one photo that made Marcus's breath catch. His father, younger than in the picture Marcus kept hidden, maybe in his late 20s, standing in what looked like a university workshop. He wore safety goggles pushed up on his forehead and had his arm around another man, someone closer to college age, both of them grinning like they'd just discovered something wonderful. Your father, Diana began, then stopped. Started again. Raymond was brilliant. Too brilliant for his own good. Sometimes. He got his doctorate in mechanical engineering when he was 24. Started working on experimental energy systems right after graduation. She pulled out a patent application, the pages thick and official-looking. This was his life's work, an engine that could run on a hybrid combustion cycle. Part traditional fuel, part hydrogen separated from water vapor using a specialized catalyst system. It would have changed everything. Made cars cleaner, more efficient. Cut fuel costs by more than half. Marcus leaned forward, studying the diagrams. They matched what he'd seen inside the dead block. Almost exactly. What happened? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Diana's expression hardened. Money happened. Power happened. Your father filed for patents when you were just a baby. Within months, he had investors interested. Small companies, independent manufacturers. People who saw the potential. She touched the photograph of Raymond and the other young man. This was one of his early backers. A graduate student who'd come into family money, wanted to fund something that mattered. They built the first working prototype together. Did it work? It worked beautifully. Diana's smile was bitter. That was the problem. Word got out. The big energy companies, the fuel corporations, they started paying attention. At first, they tried to buy the patents. Offrait de Raymond Million. He refused. Said the technology needed to be open, accessible, something that could help regular people, not just make rich companies richer. She pulled out legal documents now, dense pages covered in small print. So they came after him another way. They found an old research paper he'd published in graduate school, claimed his current work violated someone else's prior patent. It didn't, not really, but they had lawyers. Expensive ones. They buried him in legal fees, tied him up in court for 3 years. Marcus watched his mother's hands shake as she sorted through the papers. He'd never seen her like this angry, this hurt, like wounds that had never properly healed were being reopened. The stress was killing him, Diana continued. Literally, he stopped sleeping, stopped eating right. All our money went to lawyers who couldn't win against corporations with unlimited resources. His investor, that young man in the photo, he sold his shares, just gave up and walked away. Said he couldn't fight anymore, couldn't risk everything he had. What was his name? Marcus asked. I don't remember. Your father never talked about him after that. Too painful, I think. The betrayal hurt more than the lawsuits. Diana's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Raymond kept fighting, though, kept believing that the truth would win, that people would see how important this technology was, that someone would care more about progress than profit. But they didn't. No, they didn't. Diana's eyes were wet now. The companies got the patents tied up in legal restrictions, made it so no one could use the technology without licensing fees, so expensive it became worthless. The prototype engines were seized as evidence, then conveniently lost. All the research data, years of work, just disappeared into corporate vaults. She pulled out a death certificate. Marcus saw the date. 11 years ago. The cause of death listed was cardiac arrest. He had a heart attack at his desk, Diana said. He was 32 years old. The doctors said it was stress-induced. I say it was murder, just slower and more legal. She looked at Marcus with eyes that held too much pain. And I swore, the day we buried your father, that I would never let you anywhere near that world. Never let you touch anything that could bring those people back into our lives. Marcus felt like the floor had tilted beneath him. The engine at Mitchell's. It's his design, isn't it? It has to be. No one else ever made that system work. No one else even came close. Diana gripped his shoulders. Marcus, baby, you need to understand something. The people who destroyed your father, they're still out there. Still powerful. Still protecting their interests. If they find out Raymond Williams' son just fixed one of his engines, if they realize you have the same mind he did, the same gift, they'll come after me too. They'll come after both of us. Diana pulled him into a hug, fierce and desperate. I can't lose you. I can't bury another Williams, because he was too smart for his own good. I won't. Marcus hugged her back, but his mind was racing. The engine at the shop wasn't just any custom project. It was his father's stolen legacy, rebuilt by someone who'd either bought the buried patents or pieced it together from fragments and memories. And now that engine was running again, better than ever, because Marcus had the same instincts Raymond Williams had possessed. The same curse, his mother would call it. The same gift, Marcus thought. When they finally pulled apart, Diana wiped her eyes and started putting the papers back in the box. Tomorrow, you're not going to Mitchell's. I'll call Roy. Tell him you're sick. We'll figure something else out. Somewhere safe for you to be after school. Mom, this isn't a discussion, Marcus. But even as she said it, both of them knew it was already too late. The call had been made. The owner was coming. And whatever happened next was already in motion, like an engine that had been started and couldn't simply be turned off. That night, Marcus lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He thought about his father, working himself to death for an idea corporations wanted buried. He thought about the investor who'd abandoned him, choosing survival over principle. He thought about the engine sitting in bay for a ghost made of metal and combustion, waiting for someone to understand it. He wondered if his father had felt this same mixture of fear and determination. This need to prove something, to finish something, even when the smart choice was to walk away. The next morning, Diana made the call to Roy. Her voice was flat, professional, as she explained that Marcus wouldn't be coming in, that he was under the weather, that she appreciated Roy's understanding. But an hour later, Roy called back. Marcus was in his room when he heard his mother's sharp intake of breath from the kitchen. He crept to the doorway and listened. I understand, Diana was saying, her voice tight. No, of course. Yes, we'll be there. She hung up, stood perfectly still for a long moment. Mom, Diana turned to him. Her expression was unreadable. Get dressed. Nice clothes if you have any that still fit. We're going to the shop. I thought you said the owner of the engine is there. He's requesting to meet you. Both of us. Diana's hands were shaking again. Roy says if we don't come, there might be legal complications. Something about industrial sabotage, unauthorized tampering with private property. Marcus felt ice spread through his chest. They're threatening us? They're scaring Roy, which amounts to the same thing. Diana closed her eyes briefly. Get dressed. We face this together. 40 minutes later, they pulled into the Mitchell's Auto Works parking lot. It looked different in the late morning light, less familiar, more threatening. There was a new vehicle in the lot that didn't belong. A black luxury sedan, spotless despite the industrial grime that covered everything else in the district. No Liederplatz, no company logos, just tinted windows and an aura of money and power that made their old Toyota look like a toy by comparison. Two men in dark suits stood near the sedan. They weren't mechanics. Security, Marcus realized. Private security. Diana parked as far from a black car as possible. She turned to Marcus before they got out. Listen to me. Answer questions if you're asked directly. Be polite. Don't volunteer information. And for God's sake, don't try to impress anyone. Understand? Marcus nodded, though his heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might crack his ribs. They walked toward the entrance together. One of the security men spoke quietly into a radio as they approached. The bay door was open, but the usual noise of the shop was absent. No tools clanging, no radio playing, no voices shouting across the floor. Inside, the entire crew was gathered near Bay 4, but they stood back from the dead block like it was surrounded by an invisible barrier. Roy stood off to the side, his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. Carter, Jamie, Tommy, Dale, all of them watching Marcus and Diana enter with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed nervousness. And standing directly in front of the engine, studying it with the focus of someone reading a book written in a language only they understood, was a man Marcus had never seen before. He wasn't what Marcus expected. Not old, maybe in his early 40s. Not imposing physically, average height and build. He wore expensive clothes, but nothing flashy. Dark pants, a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. No tie. His hair was starting to gray at the temples. His hands, Marcus noticed, had small scars across the knuckles, the kind you got from working with tools, from building things, from cutting yourself on sharp edges in tight spaces. He didn't turn when they entered, didn't acknowledge them at all, just kept running his fingers along the engine casing, touching it with a gentleness that seemed almost reverent. Roy cleared his throat. Mr. Thorne, the boy and his mother are here. Thorne. The name meant nothing to Marcus. Still, the man didn't turn. Instead, he spoke to the engine itself, his voice quiet but clear in the silent bay. Who realigned my vapor chamber? The question hung in the air. No one answered. Thorne finally turned. His eyes swept across the gathered mechanics, dismissing them one by one, until his gaze landed on Marcus. He studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You, Thorne said. It wasn't a question. Marcus felt his mother's hand tighten on his shoulder. He swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Come here. Diana's grip became almost painful, but she didn't try to hold him back. Marcus walked forward slowly, aware of every eye in the room tracking his movement. He stopped a few feet from the engine, close enough to smell the lingering scent of oil and metal and that strange, sweet ozone smell he'd noticed before. Thorne's eyes were gray, Marcus noticed. Tired eyes. Haunted eyes. Tell me what you did, Thorne said. Marcus glanced back at his mother. She gave a small nod. Permission, or maybe just resignation. I loosened a valve connector that was over-tightened, Marcus said quietly, and adjusted the pressure regulator on the secondary chamber. That's all. That's all, Thorne repeated, something almost like amusement flickering across his face. Do you know what that secondary chamber does? Yes, sir. It's a catalyst chamber for hydrogen separation. Takes water vapor from the combustion process, breaks it down into hydrogen and oxygen using a mesh catalyst, then feeds the hydrogen back into the primary combustion chamber while using the oxygen for thermal regulation. The room went completely silent. Even the distant sounds of traffic from the street outside seemed to fade away. Thorne's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Who taught you that? Nobody taught me. I figured it out by watching. Watching what? The way it failed. The vapor patterns, the residue formation, the pressure anomalies. Marcus gestured toward the engine. It's designed to run on a hybrid cycle, but everyone here was treating it like a standard combustion engine. They were forcing fuel into a chamber that was meant to process vapor. That's why it kept overheating and seizing. Thorne took a step closer. How old are you? 13. Where did you learn thermodynamics? YouTube. Library books. Watching the mechanics here. What's your name? Marcus hesitated. His mother had told him to answer questions, but some instinct told him this question was different. This question was dangerous. Marcus, he said, leaving off his last name. Marcus what? Another hesitation. Longer this time. From across the bay, Diana's voice cut through the tension. Williams. His name is Marcus Williams. The effect was immediate and devastating. Thorne's face drained of all color. His hand, still resting on the engine casing, began to tremble. He stared at Marcus like he was seeing a ghost, like the concrete floor had just opened up beneath him and he was falling into something dark and bottomless. Williams, Thorne whispered. He said it again, louder. Williams. He pulled something from his pocket with shaking hands. A folded piece of paper, worn from being carried and handled. He unfolded it carefully and held it up next to Marcus's face, comparing. It was the same photograph Marcus had seen last night. His father and the young investor, arms around each other, grinning in that university workshop. Marcus looked at the photo, looked at Thorne, saw the resemblance to the young man in the picture, saw it in the shape of the nose, the set of the jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead despite being 20 years older and shot through with gray. Understanding crashed over Marcus like a physical weight. The investor who'd abandoned his father. The one who'd sold his shares and walked away. It was him. Thorne saw the recognition in Marcus's eyes. Saw the moment the pieces clicked together. Raymond, Thorne said, his voice breaking slightly. Raymond Williams. He was your father. It wasn't a question, but Marcus nodded anyway. Thorne's legs seemed to give out. He sat down heavily on a nearby workbench, still staring at Marcus like he was something impossible. His hands gripped the edge of the bench, so hard his knuckles went white. Everyone, Thorne said without looking away from Marcus, get out. Sir, Roy started. Everyone except the boy and his mother. Out. Now. The mechanics filed out slowly, reluctantly, throwing glances over their shoulders. Roy was the last to leave, pulling the bay door partially closed behind him to give the illusion of privacy. When they were alone, Thorne finally looked at Diana. Mrs. Williams, I need you to know something. I need you to understand. His voice caught. He tried again. What I did to your husband. What I failed to do for him. It's something I've lived with every day for the past 11 years. You abandoned him, Diana said flatly. When he needed you most, you walked away. Yes. Thor didn't try to deny it, didn't try to soften it. I was 23 years old. I'd inherited money I didn't earn, funded a project I barely understood, and when the corporations came after us, when the lawsuits started piling up, I got scared. So scared I couldn't think straight. My lawyers told me to sell, to cut my losses, to save what I could of my inheritance before it all disappeared into legal fees. He looked down at his scarred hands. So I did. I sold my shares for pennies on the dollar. Signed away my rights to the patents. Walked away from Raymond and his life's work because I chose money over principle. Chose safety over someone who called me a friend. That doesn't change anything, Diana said. No, it doesn't. Thorne finally stood up, though his legs still looked unsteady. But I need you to know what happened after. What I did with the guilt that's been eating me alive ever since. He walked back to the engine, placed both hands on it like it was something sacred. I spent years trying to forget. Built a career in energy sector consulting. Made more money than I knew what to do with. Married a woman I didn't love and divorced her 3 years later. I was miserable. Successful and absolutely miserable. Thorne turned to face them both. Then 5 years ago, I used every connection I had, every dollar I could spare, to track down what happened to Raymond's patents. They've been buried in a subsidiary of an energy conglomerate, hidden so deep most people didn't even know they existed. I bought them back. Cost me everything I'd built, every relationship I'd leveraged, but I got them. Marcus felt his anger warring with confusion. Why? Because I owed him. Owed his memory. Owed the dream we'd shared. Thorn gestured at the engine. I spent the last 3 years trying to rebuild what we'd created. Used the patent documents, corrupted files. I managed to recover my own memories of the prototype. Hired engineers, specialists, people smarter than me. None of them could make it work. The engine would run for a few seconds and then destroy itself. Just like it did here. He looked directly at Marcus. Until you walked into this shop and asked a question everyone laughed at. Until you saw what trained engineers missed. Until you made the same intuitive connections your father made 20 years ago. Marcus didn't know what to say. His emotions were tangled, knotted, impossible to separate. This man had betrayed his father, let him die broken and defeated. But he'd also spent years trying to atone, trying to resurrect something beautiful that had been murdered by greed and fear. What happens now? Diana asked, her voice hard. You've seen that Raymond's son can do what Raymond could do. What are you going to do with that information? Thorn was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his other pocket and pulled out a phone. He made a call, speaking quietly, giving instructions Marcus couldn't quite hear. When he hung up, he said, I'm going to do what I should have done 15 years ago. I'm going to fight. Fight who? Marcus asked. Everyone who buried your father's work. Everyone who suppressed this technology because it threatened their profits. Thorn's expression hardened into something Marcus hadn't seen before. Determination. Purpose. And I'm going to do it publicly, loudly, with the best lawyers money can buy, and a story that will make those corporations wish they'd never heard the name Williams. He looked at Marcus again, really looked at him, seeing not just a boy, but a legacy. But I need you to show me something first. I need you to prove that this engine isn't just running on luck or coincidence. I need you to demonstrate that you understand it the way Raymond did. Marcus glanced at his mother. She looked terrified, protective, but she also looked like she understood something important was happening here. Something that went beyond safety and fear. Show him, Diana said quietly. Show him what you can do. Thorn gestured toward a tool cart. The engine's running better, but it's not running right. Not completely. There are still inefficiencies, pressure variations, thermal irregularities. If you really understand this system, you can fix them. It wasn't a test. It was an invitation. Marcus walked to the engine, touched it the way Thorn had, with respect and curiosity. Then he picked up tools and began to work. For the next hour, he made adjustments that came to him intuitively. Opened panels the mechanics had never noticed. Recalibrated systems they'd assumed were fixed values. Explained each step in quiet, precise language that revealed a mind operating on a level most people never reached. Thorn watched in silence. Occasionally he asked questions. Marcus answered them easily, naturally the way someone might discuss breathing or walking. When Marcus finally stepped back, his hands black with grease, his shirt stained with oil, Thorn moved forward. Let's see. They started the engine together. Thorn's hands shook as he turned the key. The engine roared to life. But this time, it didn't just run smoothly. It ran perfectly. The sound was deeper, richer, more controlled. The pressure gauge held steady in the optimal range. The temperature stabilized exactly where it should. The vapor output was clean, minimal, efficient. It ran for 2 minutes. 3, 5. Thorn shut it down not because it was failing, but because tears were running down his face and he couldn't see clearly anymore. He pulled out his phone again. This time, when he made the call, his voice was stronger. Get the legal team mobilized. Full forensic audit of every patent transfer. I want documentation going back 20 years. And give me a meeting with the federal energy regulators. He paused, listening to the response. Because, Thorn said, looking at Marcus, we're about to expose the biggest suppression of alternative energy technology in modern history. And we're going to do it with the one piece of evidence they can't argue with. We're going to do it with a 13-year-old boy who can do what billion-dollar research teams couldn't. He ended the call and turned to Marcus and Diana. This is going to get ugly. Dangerous, possibly. The people who buried Raymond's work, they won't go quietly. They'll fight with everything they have. Then we fight back, Marcus said. For the first time since entering the shop, Thorn smiled. It was a broken smile, weighted with regret and pain. But underneath, it was something else. Something like hope. "Yes," he said, "we fight back." Outside the partially closed bay door, the mechanics who'd been pretending not to listen stood in shocked silence. They heard enough. They understood enough. The water engine kid, the boy they'd mocked and laughed at, had just changed everything. And the man who'd owned that engine, the mysterious client they'd all been afraid of, was about to start a war with some of the most powerful corporations in the country. Tommy Preston, standing near the break room door, thought about all the jokes he'd made, about the toy boat he'd put on Marcus's workbench, about the times he'd dumped water near the engine and told the kid to fuel it up. His stomach turned. He'd laughed at genius, mocked the son of a man who'd been destroyed for trying to help people. He wasn't laughing anymore. None of them were, because the boy who'd asked if an engine could run on water had just proven that the real question wasn't about what was possible. It was about who got to decide what the world was allowed to know. And that decision, for the first time in 15 years, was about to be taken out of the hands of people who'd profited from keeping it secret. The engine sat in Bay 4, clean and quiet and perfect, waiting, just like Marcus had been waiting his whole life without knowing it. Waiting for the moment when his father's ghost would stop being a tragedy and become a revolution. The days following that confrontation in Bay 4 moved with a speed that left Marcus dizzy. One moment, he was a boy who swept floors and stayed invisible. The next, he was sitting in conference rooms with lawyers in expensive suits who asked him technical questions about vapor compression and catalyst degradation rates. Thorne moved fast. Within 24 hours of watching Marcus perfect the engine, he'd assembled a team that looked more like a military operation than a business venture. Lawyers, yes, but also forensic accountants, patent specialists, energy sector analysts, and a public relations firm that specialized in what they called high-stakes corporate exposure. Marcus and Diana were moved out of their apartment. Not forcefully, but Thorne made it clear that staying there was dangerous. "The moment my legal team starts filing subpoenas," he explained over coffee in a hotel suite that cost more per night than Diana made in a month, "the companies involved will start looking for leverage. Your apartment building has no security, no cameras, no way to know who's coming or going." So they moved into a furnished corporate housing unit in a building with a doorman, security cameras, and electronic keycard access. Diana protested at first, uncomfortable with accepting what felt like charity from the man who'd abandoned her husband. But Thorne didn't frame it as a favor. "This is my fault," he said simply. "If I'd stood by Raymond 15 years ago, you wouldn't be in danger now. The least I can do is make sure you're safe while we finish what he started." Marcus spent his days in a private workspace Thorne had set up, a clean laboratory-style room with tools and equipment that made the setup at Mitchell's look like a junkyard. The engine had been transported there, along with documentation that Thorne had been collecting for years. Patent applications, technical specifications, corporate memos that had been leaked or purchased or obtained through legal discovery in unrelated cases. But the most damning evidence was the engine itself, and Marcus's ability to make it work. Thorne brought in independent engineers to observe, people with credentials from MIT and Stanford, researchers who'd spent careers studying alternative energy systems. They watched Marcus work with expressions that shifted from skepticism to confusion to something approaching awe. "He's not guessing," one of them said after Marcus explained why a particular catalyst mesh configuration would improve hydrogen separation efficiency by nearly 18%. "He's seeing the molecular interactions, understanding them intuitively. I've worked with teams that took months to reach conclusions he's making in minutes." His father was the same way, Thorne said quietly. Raymond could look at an engine and just know, like he could see the physics happening in real time. The comparison made Marcus uncomfortable. He wasn't trying to be his father. He was just trying to understand how things worked. But everyone kept seeing Raymond Williams when they looked at him, kept searching for the ghost of a dead genius in a living boy. Diana watched all of this with increasing worry. She sat in on meetings where lawyers discussed litigation strategies and exposure timelines. She heard them talk about media coordination and federal regulatory involvement and potential criminal charges against corporate executives. And she heard them discuss the risks. "They'll come after the boy's credibility first. One lawyer explained during a strategy session. Claim he's being coached. That Thorne is manipulating him. They'll dig into his school records, his mother's employment history, anything they can use to paint him as unreliable. Let them try, Thorne said. We'll put him in front of independent technical reviewers. Have him demonstrate his understanding to people who can't be bought or intimidated. They might not stop at credibility attacks, another lawyer warned. When companies this size feel threatened, when the financial stakes are this high, they've been known to use more aggressive tactics. The room went quiet. Everyone knew what that meant without it being said explicitly. Diana stood up abruptly. I need to speak with Mr. Thorne. Privately. They moved to a smaller office. Diana closed the door and turned to face him with an expression that was pure protective fury. My husband died fighting these people, she said, her voice shaking. I will not watch my son die too. I don't care about patents or justice or exposing corruption. I care about Marcus living to see 14. Thorne met her anger without flinching. I understand. And if you want to stop this right now, we stop. I'll pay to relocate you somewhere safe. New city, new names, new lives. I'll make sure you're protected and provided for. But they already know about Marcus. They know Raymond's son just fixed an engine their best engineers couldn't understand. Even if we stop now, even if we disappear, that knowledge exists. And people who suppress technology worth billions don't just forget about threats to their interests. Diana's hands clenched into fists. So we're trapped. Fight or hide. Either way, we're targets. Yes, Thorne said honestly. I'm sorry. If I could go back, if I could undo what I did 15 years ago, stand by Raymond when it mattered, maybe none of this would be happening. But I can't. All I can do is try to finish this the right way. Publicly. Legally. With enough attention that making you disappear would be impossible. You're gambling with my son's life. I'm gambling with all our lives, Thorne corrected. Mine included. The moment I started buying back those patents, the moment I began rebuilding Raymond's engine, I made myself a target too. This isn't about clearing my conscience anymore. It's about survival. For all of us. Diana was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question that really mattered. What does Marcus want? He wants to fight, Thorne said. He told me yesterday that hiding his father's work again would be the same as letting them win twice. That Raymond died believing he'd failed, and Marcus won't let that be his father's legacy. Diana closed her eyes. He's 13. He shouldn't have to make choices like this. No, he shouldn't. But he's Raymond's son, and that means he never really had a choice at all. The investigation Thorne's team launched was methodical and devastating. Forensic accountants traced patent transfers through shell companies and offshore subsidiaries, following money trails that zigzagged through the Cayman Islands, Delaware holding companies, and Swiss banking records. They found Raymond Williams' original work buried in the holdings of Titan Corp Energy Solutions, a massive conglomerate that supplied industrial fuel to half the country and had annual revenues exceeding $40 billion. But the trail didn't stop there. The patents had been moved, licensed, and sub-licensed through a web of agreements designed to obscure their origin. Components of Raymond's hydrogen assist system appeared in research projects funded by 3 different corporations. Modified versions showed up in military contracts for next-generation vehicle systems and experimental power generation programs that were classified but left paper trails in budget documents. What emerged was a picture of systematic technological theft on a scale that shocked even Thorne's experienced legal team. Raymond's integrated design had been carved up like a stolen car, with pieces sold separately to different buyers who might never realize they were holding fragments of the same revolutionary system. They didn't just steal his work. One of the patent specialists explained to Marcus during a review session, spreading out documents across a conference table like evidence at a crime scene. They dissected it, took pieces and scattered them across different projects so no one would see the complete picture. Your father designed an integrated system, a coherent whole where every component worked together. They turned it into spare parts, then sold those parts to people who had no idea what they were really buying. Why would they do that? Marcus asked, studying the web of transfers and licensing agreements. Because a working alternative energy system is a threat. But individual components, divorced from the system that makes them revolutionary, are just interesting research. They neutralize the threat while still profiting from the innovation. Genius, in a horrible way. Can we prove it? Marcus asked. With your help, yes. You can demonstrate how these pieces fit together. Show that they're not independent innovations, but fragments of a single coherent design. When you explain how the catalyst mesh coordinates with the vapor compression chamber, how the thermal regulation system depends on the hydrogen separation rate, you're proving that these components were designed as a unified system, not developed independently by different research teams. The political implications were staggering. If Raymond Williams had successfully patented and developed his hydrogen-assist combustion system 15 years ago, the entire trajectory of energy development would have changed. Billions of dollars in fuel sales, infrastructure investments, and corporate valuations were built on technology that might have been obsolete if Raymond's work hadn't been suppressed. Economic models would have shifted. International energy dependencies would have evolved differently. The geopolitical landscape itself might look different. This isn't just about one engine, Thorne told Marcus one evening as they worked late in the lab. The city lights visible through the windows, the only sound the quiet hum of diagnostic equipment. It's about systematic suppression of alternative energy development. Your father wasn't the only inventor who got crushed. He's just the one we can prove because you exist, because you can demonstrate that the technology works. Marcus looked up from the catalyst mesh he was examining under a microscope, the magnified structure revealing the precise lattice pattern that made hydrogen separation possible. How many others were there? We found documentation of at least 7 similar cases over the past 20 years. Independent inventors or small research teams who developed promising alternative energy systems, solar thermal systems that were more efficient than anything on the market, mechanical battery systems that could store energy at a fraction of current costs, biofuel processes that didn't require agricultural land. All of them ran into the same pattern. Initial interest, venture capital attention, then suddenly legal challenges, patent disputes, regulatory complications, then either forced sales of their patents for pennies on the dollar or litigation that bankrupted them before their technology could reach production. Why doesn't anyone know about this? Because the companies involved are very good at making problems disappear quietly. Non-disclosure agreements as part of settlement deals. Confidentiality clauses that prevent people from talking about what happened to them. When you have unlimited legal resources and political connections, you can bury almost anything that threatens your business model. Thorne paused, his expression grim. But they've never had to deal with something like you. I'm just a kid who's good with engines. You're proof that Raymond's system works. Living, breathing, 13-year-old proof that can't be buried in a file cabinet or hidden behind a legal agreement. You can stand in front of people and make that engine run. You can explain why it works in ways that trained engineers can verify. That's what scares them. They can discredit documents, claim patents were filed incorrectly, argue that prototypes never actually functioned properly. But they can't make you disappear without making themselves look guilty. The fear proved justified when the first retaliation came. It started with Marcus's school. Suddenly, there were questions about his enrollment, concerns about his attendance record, suggestions that he might benefit from alternative educational placement. The principal called Diana in for a meeting where she was informed that Marcus's recent absences were troubling and his involvement in adult legal matters was inappropriate for a minor. The district superintendent sent a formal letter suggesting that Marcus might be better served by a program for exceptional students with complex family situations. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to sound concerned rather than threatening. But the message underneath was clear: get your son back in line, or we'll find reasons to make his education difficult. Thorne's lawyers shut that down within 48 hours, but the message was clear. They were being watched. Pressure was being applied through every available avenue. Then came the financial probing. Diana's bank account was suddenly flagged for review. Her credit card was temporarily frozen due to suspicious activity that turned out to be her normal grocery shopping. The building management at their new corporate housing unit received an anonymous complaint about unauthorized occupants that triggered a lease review. None of it was overtly illegal. All of it was designed to create stress, to make them feel exposed and vulnerable, to remind them that powerful people were paying attention. The articles started appearing next, small at first, in industry trade publications and energy sector blogs. Questions about the validity of experimental hydrogen assist systems. Expert opinions from scientists with impressive credentials explaining why such technology was theoretically interesting but practically non-viable. No mention of Raymond Williams or Marcus or Thorne specifically, but the timing was obvious to anyone paying attention. One article in particular caught Thorne's attention. It was written by a professor at a prestigious engineering school, someone whose research was funded by grants from Titan Corp Energy Solutions. The piece systematically dismissed hydrogen-assist combustion as a recurring fantasy among amateur inventors who misunderstand basic thermodynamic principles. It cited studies, referenced established science, and made the whole concept sound absurd. "They're seeding doubt," the PR specialist explained during a team meeting, pulling up the article on a large screen. "Getting their narrative out first. When we go public, they want people to already believe that this kind of technology is impossible. They want the default assumption to be that we're either lying or deluded, even though we can demonstrate it working." Marcus asked, especially because of that, if they can convince people to dismiss the possibility before they see the evidence becomes easier to explain away. They'll claim we're using tricks, hiding a conventional fuel source, manipulating the data. The goal isn't to prove we're wrong. The goal is to create enough doubt that people don't bother looking closely enough to see we're right. Thorne leaned back in his chair, thinking. Then we need to control the revelation. Make it impossible to dismiss. Ow! We go bigger than I planned. Not just legal filings and regulatory complaints. A full public demonstration. Media present. Independent technical reviewers. Live documentation of the engine operating at full capacity. He looked at Marcus. "With you explaining exactly how it works." Marcus felt his stomach twist. "In front of cameras? In front of the world," Thorne said. "It's the only way to make this too big to bury." The preparation for the public demonstration consumed the next 3 weeks. Thorne rented an industrial facility large enough to accommodate the engine, testing equipment, and an audience of over 200 people. Invitations went out to media outlets, energy sector analysts, federal regulators, and independent engineering firms. The response was mixed. Some ignored it completely. Others sent polite declinations. But enough expressed interest that Thorne knew they'd have the audience they needed. Marcus practiced his presentation obsessively, not because he didn't understand the material, but because explaining complex thermodynamics to people who desperately wanted to not believe him was different than talking to engineers who were genuinely curious. "Don't get defensive," the PR specialist coached him. "When someone challenges you, treat it as an honest question, even if it's not. Walk them through your reasoning step by step. Make them work to dismiss you. What if I freeze up? You won't. You've explained this system to me 6 times now, and each time you get clearer and more confident. You know this engine better than anyone alive, except maybe your father. Trust that." Diana watched these practice sessions with a mixture of pride and terror. Her son was preparing to challenge billion-dollar corporations with nothing but his mind and his father's stolen legacy. It should have been impossible. It probably still was impossible. But watching Marcus diagram vapor flow patterns and explain catalyst activation sequences with casual brilliance, she couldn't shake the feeling that Raymond was somehow present in the room. That the dream he died for was finally getting the chance he'd never had. The night before the demonstration, Thorne found Marcus sitting alone in the lab, staring at the engine. "Can't sleep?" Thorne asked. Marcus shook his head. "Keeps running through my mind. Everything that could go wrong. Every question I might not be able to answer." Thorne sat down beside him. "Can I tell you something about your father? Something I never told anyone." Marcus nodded. The day before our first investor meeting, Raymond was terrified, completely paralyzed with fear. He was convinced he'd forget everything, that he'd sound like an idiot, that everyone would realize he had no idea what he was doing. Thorne smiled at the memory. I asked him what he was afraid of. You know what he said? What? He said he was afraid people wouldn't understand. Not that they'd reject his work, but that they wouldn't see what he saw. That he'd failed to communicate something beautiful and important. It would die inside his head where no one else could reach it. Marcus understood that fear perfectly. It was exactly what kept him awake. What did you tell him? I told him that if even one person understood, it was worth it. That ideas like his didn't need everyone to believe. They just needed enough people to keep them alive until the world was ready. Thorne looked at the engine. He convinced me that day. One terrified 26-year-old engineer convinced a kid with more money than sense that this impossible machine could change everything. And he was right. But they still destroyed him. They destroyed him before the world was ready. That was my fault, not his. I wasn't strong enough to protect what he'd built. Thorne met Marcus's eyes. But you're not him. And I'm not the same person I was 15 years ago. Tomorrow, we get to finish what Raymond started. Together. With enough witnesses that they can't make it disappear this time. Marcus felt something unknot in his chest. What if the engine doesn't work? What if something goes wrong with the demonstration? Then we'll fail publicly instead of privately. But at least we'll fail trying. Thorne stood up. Get some sleep. Tomorrow you show the world what Raymond Williams' son can do. The morning of the demonstration arrived cold and clear, one of those winter days where the sunlight felt sharp and the air smelled clean despite the industrial surroundings. The facility Thorne had rented was in an industrial park on the edge of the city, large enough to handle heavy equipment testing, but close enough to downtown that media crews could reach it easily. The building itself was anonymous, a converted warehouse with high ceilings and loading docks that had been temporarily transformed into something resembling a technical conference center. Marcus arrived early with his mother. Diana had barely slept, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands shaking as she held her coffee cup, the liquid sloshing slightly with each tremor. She'd changed clothes 3 times that morning, unable to decide what you wore to watch her 13-year-old son challenge billion-dollar corporations. Eventually, she'd settled on simple dark pants and a sweater, professional but not pretentious, the outfit of a woman who refused to be intimidated even though she clearly was. Security was everywhere. Thorne had hired a private firm, professional men and women in dark suits with earpieces and the kind of alert stillness that suggested military backgrounds. They checked credentials at the entrance, monitored access points with tablet computers, and maintained a perimeter that made the whole event feel simultaneously important and vaguely dangerous. Is all this really necessary? Diana asked, watching a security officer inspect journalist camera equipment. After last week, yes, Thorne replied. He didn't elaborate, but Marcus had overheard enough to know there'd been threats. Credible ones. The kind that required security personnel with concealed weapons and contingency plans for evacuations. Someone had sent an email describing exactly how they'd sabotaged the demonstration. Another anonymous caller had suggested that accidents happen to people who don't know when to quit. The local police had been notified, though Thorne's security team made it clear they trusted their own people more than they trusted underpaid city cops who might have connections to the very corporations they were challenging. The attendees began arriving around 9. Journalists with cameras and recording equipment, analysts from energy sector research firms, federal regulators from 3 different agencies, independent engineers whose credentials Thorne's team had verified extensively, and scattered among them, representatives from major energy corporations, there to observe and report back to executives who were very interested in what was about to happen. By 10 o'clock, the space was full. 237 people, according to the security count. More than Thorne had hoped for. Enough to matter. The engine sat on a raised platform in the center of the space, surrounded by monitoring equipment and diagnostic tools. Marcus stood beside it, wearing clean clothes that still felt too formal, too much like a costume. His hands were already sweating. Thorne stepped up to the microphone. The room gradually quieted. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "My name is Daniel Thorne, and 15 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. I abandoned a friend and a partner who was trying to change the world. I walked away from revolutionary technology, because I was afraid of the fight it would require. That friend's name was Dr. Raymond Williams, and he died believing he'd failed. The room was completely silent now, but he didn't fail. His work survived, and today his son is going to demonstrate why some of the largest energy corporations in this country have spent 15 years trying to make sure you never learned Raymond Williams' name. Thorne stepped back. Marcus stepped forward. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. 237 faces staring at him. Cameras recording. Everything riding on his ability to explain what he understood intuitively but had never tried to communicate to this many people at once. Then he looked at the engine, his father's engine, and something clicked into place. "My name is Marcus Williams," he said, his voice quieter than Thorne's but steady. "And I'm going to show you an engine that shouldn't exist." He began to explain, not with the hesitation of a 13-year-old boy, but with the clarity of someone who understood his subject completely. He walked them through the basic principles of hydrogen-assist combustion, explained how water vapor could be separated into component elements using catalyst, mesh, and precise temperature control, demonstrated the secondary chamber where the hydrogen was reintroduced to the combustion cycle while oxygen was used for thermal regulation. People started taking notes. Cameras zoomed in on the diagrams he'd prepared. Questions came, and Marcus answered them. Technical questions that would have stumped most engineers twice his age. He answered them easily, naturally, building a case that was impossible to dismiss. Then he fired up the engine. The sound filled the space. Clean, powerful, efficient. Marcus walked the audience through the readouts, showing them pressure stability, temperature control, fuel efficiency numbers that made several analysts audibly gasp. The engine ran for 15 minutes, flawlessly. When Marcus finally shut it down, the room erupted completely. Questions shouted from every direction. Reporters rushing forward eagerly. Engineers demanding to examine the equipment. In the back of the room, a man in an expensive suit made a phone call. His expression was grim. The war Thorne had promised was about to begin in earnest. But for the first time in 15 years, Raymond Williams' work was visible to the world, and his son had made sure they couldn't look away. The demonstration video went viral within 6 hours. Not the carefully edited version Thorne's PR team had prepared, but raw footage shot on phones by journalists who uploaded it directly to social media. Marcus explaining hydrogen separation to a room full of skeptics. The engine running clean and steady while monitoring equipment proved every claim. A 13-year-old boy dismantling decades of corporate denial with nothing but knowledge and truth. Within 12 hours, the video had been viewed 20 million times. Within 24 hours, it had been translated into 17 languages. Comment sections filled with engineers confirming the science, teachers showing to students, people sharing stories about their own ideas being dismissed or stolen. By the next morning, Raymond Williams' name was trending globally across every major social platform. News outlets that had ignored the story suddenly scrambled to cover it, assigning teams to investigate the patent history, the corporate connections, the human drama. The narrative was too perfect to resist. Dead inventor, stolen technology, genius son exposing billion-dollar conspiracy. It had everything audiences craved, and more importantly, it had video proof that was impossible to dismiss. Titan Corp Energy Solutions issued a statement within 12 hours. Carefully worded, written by lawyers who specialized in crisis management. They acknowledged that they held certain patents related to experimental combustion systems. They denied any wrongdoing. They suggested that the demonstration, while impressive, didn't prove the technology was commercially viable. They invited independent review of their patent holdings. It was a masterclass in saying nothing while sounding reasonable. But the internet wasn't interested in reasonable. People wanted villains and heroes, and Titan Corp had just been cast in the role they'd spent millions trying to avoid. The federal investigations launched faster than anyone expected. 3 separate regulatory agencies announced reviews of energy sector patent practices. Congressional staffers started making calls. A senator from California, someone with a reputation for taking on corporate power, requested all documentation related to Raymond Williams' original patent applications. Thorne's legal team worked around the clock, providing evidence to investigators, coordinating with federal prosecutors, building cases that would take years to fully prosecute, but were already causing damage through their mere existence. Stock prices for Titan Corp and two affiliated companies dropped 8% in the first week. Not catastrophic, but enough to get board members asking uncomfortable questions. The mechanics from Mitchell's Auto Works watched all of this unfold on television and social media. They saw Marcus on the news, explaining complex thermodynamics with the same patient clarity he tried to use that day. They'd laughed at him. They saw their shop mentioned in articles as the place where Raymond Williams technology had been secretly rebuilt. Tommy Preston couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw himself dumping water near the engine, telling a 13-year-old genius to fuel it up. He saw the toy boat on Marcus's workbench, heard his own voice making jokes that had seemed harmless at the time, but now felt like participating in something cruel and stupid. He wasn't the only one. Carter Wells, the veteran mechanic who dismissed Marcus's question as ignorance, found himself unable to explain to his own teenage daughter why he'd mocked a kid for being smarter than him. Jamie Brooks stopped talking about his certifications after realizing they'd meant nothing compared to raw understanding. Roy Brennan, the foreman who'd allowed Marcus to stay but never actually listened to him, sent a message through Thorne's office. Just 2 words, "I'm sorry." Thorne made sure Marcus saw it, but the boy's response was quiet and complicated. "They didn't know," Marcus said. "How could they know what they were looking at?" But Dale Harrison, the old mechanic who'd recognized the design and warned Marcus to stay quiet, felt something different. Relief, maybe. Vindication that he'd been right about the technology being dangerous to expose, but also gratitude that someone had been brave enough to do it anyway. The attacks came harder after the initial publicity wave. Titan Corp's public relations might have been defensive, but their private tactics were aggressive. Suddenly, there were questions about the demonstration's authenticity. Anonymous engineers posted detailed critiques online, claiming the engine must have been running on hidden conventional fuel. Some suggested Thorne had bribed the independent reviewers. Others implied Marcus was a trained performer, coached to repeat words he didn't really understand. But for every attack, there are defenders. Real engineers, ones without corporate ties, who examined the available data and confirmed the system's feasibility. Universities requested permission to study the engine. Environmental groups championed the technology as proof that alternatives to fossil fuels had been suppressed. The story became bigger than Raymond Williams or Marcus or even Thorne. It became a symbol of corporate greed versus human innovation. Diana watched the news coverage with mixed emotions. Pride in her son, certainly. Vindication that Raymond hadn't been crazy or wrong, but also fear that deepened with each new headline. Her 13-year-old child was now the face of a movement he hadn't asked to lead. His image was everywhere. His name was known, and powerful people who'd killed his father's dream were now forced to acknowledge his existence. "What have we done?" she asked Thorne one evening, both of them watching Marcus give an interview to a science journalist who actually understood what he was saying. "We finished what Raymond started," Thorne replied. "Whether that was wise or not, I honestly don't know. But it's done now. The world knows." The lawsuits began in the 3rd week. Titan Corp filed against Thorne personally, claiming he'd stolen proprietary information when he bought back the patents. 2 smaller energy companies joined with their own complaints. The legal arguments were technical and complex, designed to bog down the case in procedural fights that would take years to resolve. But Thorne had expected this. His legal team was ready. They filed countersuits immediately, claiming fraud, patent misappropriation, and conspiracy to suppress technology. They subpoenaed documents. They deposed executives. They turned the legal battle into a public spectacle where every filing was analyzed by journalists and activists. Marcus was kept mostly separate from the legal warfare. Thorne made sure of that. The boy had done his part. He demonstrated the technology and explained the science. Now it was up to adults with law degrees to fight the battles he shouldn't have to fight. Instead, Marcus returned to something closer to normal life. School, though he'd switched to a private institution that understood his situation and gave him flexibility. Homework, though it felt absurd to study basic algebra when he could design combustion systems. Time with his mother, who was adjusting to not cleaning offices anymore, to having financial security for the first time since Raymond died. But Marcus also spent time in Thorne's laboratory, not under pressure now, not trying to prove anything, just exploring, learning, building smaller versions of his father's engine, testing improvements, documenting everything meticulously. One afternoon, working alone, he made a breakthrough that had eluded both his father and Thorne. By adjusting the catalyst mesh pattern and modifying the vapor flow dynamics, he increased the system's efficiency by another 12%. It was a small change in design, but a massive improvement in performance. When he showed Thorne, the man just stared at the modified engine for a long moment. Then he laughed, a sound that was equal parts amazement and sadness. Your father spent 5 years trying to crack that exact problem. You did it in 3 weeks. I had better equipment, Marcus said. You had his mind, Thorne corrected, but without the weight of knowing how important it was. You could explore because you weren't desperate. That's the gift he never got to give himself. 6 months after the demonstration, something shifted. The legal battles were still ongoing, likely to continue for years. But the technology itself was no longer containable. 3 universities had built working prototypes based on the publicly available information from the demonstration. A startup company in Germany announced they were developing commercial applications. The design was out there now, in the world, impossible to suppress again. Titan Corp stock had recovered somewhat, but the company had restructured, forced out 2 board members, and quietly settled several of the less defensible lawsuits. They weren't destroyed, but they were damaged in ways that would take years to repair. More importantly, the broader conversation had changed. Government funding was redirected toward alternative energy research. Regulations were proposed to prevent patent suppression. Raymond Williams became a name that appeared in engineering textbooks, in articles about corporate corruption, in documentaries about innovation versus industry. The engine itself was eventually donated to the Smithsonian, placed in a special exhibition about suppressed technologies and their eventual emergence. Marcus attended the installation ceremony with his mother and Thorne. He watched crews carefully position his father's life's work behind protective glass, accompanied by plaques explaining its history and significance. A journalist asked him how it felt, seeing his father's engine in a museum. Marcus thought about the question carefully before answering. It feels like it can finally rest, he said. It doesn't have to prove anything anymore. It exists. People know it exists. That's what my father wanted. But Marcus himself wasn't resting. By the time he turned 14, he'd filed for his first patent. Not for an engine, but for an improved catalyst manufacturing process that made hydrogen separation more efficient and cheaper to produce. Thorne helped with the legal work, but the innovation was entirely Marcus's. A foundation was established in Raymond Williams' name, funded by the settlement money from various lawsuits and Thorne's personal contributions. Its mission was simple: support independent inventors, especially those facing legal challenges from established corporations. Protect innovation. Prevent what happened to Raymond from happening to others. Diana ran community outreach programs through the foundation. She visited schools in underserved neighborhoods, talked to kids who loved building things, showed them that intelligence wasn't determined by zip code or family income. She told them about a boy from their kind of neighborhood who'd changed the world by asking a question everyone said was stupid. Marcus taught occasionally at the foundation when he had something specific to share. Weekend workshops where teenagers could learn about combustion engines and thermodynamics and the physics of making impossible things real. He was patient with questions, never rushing explanations. He never made anyone feel stupid for not understanding immediately. He remembered what it felt like to be laughed at for curiosity, for asking questions that seemed foolish to people who thought they already knew everything. The engine's real legacy, though, wasn't in museums or patents or foundation work. It was in the applications that started appearing. Small-scale power generation systems for rural clinics in developing countries. Backup generators that ran cleaner and cheaper than conventional alternatives. Marine engines for fishing vessels that reduced fuel costs by 40%. The technology didn't revolutionize the entire energy sector overnight. That wasn't realistic despite the media hype. But it carved out niches, created alternatives, proved that different approaches were possible. It forced established companies to innovate or lose market share. It opened doors that had been locked by corporate monopolies. 2 years after the demonstration, Marcus visited Mitchell's Auto Works. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to see where it all started. The shop looked the same. Same oil-stained floors, same heavy machinery, same smell of metal and diesel. Roy Brennan shook his hand, the gesture awkward but sincere. The crew had followed Marcus's story, watched him on television, read articles about the foundation and the patents and the lawsuits. They knew what they'd been part of, even if they hadn't understood it at the time. Tommy Preston apologized directly, face to face. No excuses about not knowing, just acknowledgement that he'd been cruel to someone who didn't deserve it. Marcus accepted the apology with the grace of someone who'd already moved past the hurt. "You taught me something important," he told Tommy. "You taught me that being right isn't enough. You have to be strong enough to stay right when everyone tells you you're wrong." That's a valuable lesson. Bay 4 was empty now, the space where the dead block had sat converted back to normal work area. But Marcus could still picture it there, could remember the first time he'd touched it, smelled the exhaust, noticed the crystalline residue that nobody else thought was important. "Does this engine run on water?" he'd asked, knowing even then that the question was more complicated than it seemed. Knowing that engines didn't run on water itself, but on what water could become when properly understood and precisely manipulated. They'd laughed at him for that question. For years afterward, he'd remembered that laughter as humiliation. But standing in that empty bay as a 15-year-old patent holder and the youngest person ever to testify before a congressional energy committee, Marcus realized the laughter didn't matter. The question had been right. The curiosity had been valid. The willingness to ask when he didn't know had been exactly the quality that made innovation possible. His father had died believing he'd failed. That was the tragedy Raymond Williams never got to escape. But Marcus was making sure his father's legacy wasn't failure. It was proof that good ideas don't die. They wait. They survive in hidden notebooks and locked boxes and in the minds of children who inherit curiosity along with grief. The engine never ran on water. That was technically true. It ran on hydrogen separated from water through catalytic processes and thermodynamics. But more accurately, it ran on understanding, on the willingness to see systems differently, on the courage to ask questions that made people laugh. And now, because a 13-year-old boy had asked one of those laughable questions in a garage full of men who thought they knew everything, the world was different. Not transformed overnight into utopia, not revolutionized beyond recognition, but different in small, important ways that would compound over decades. Marcus Williams walked out of Mitchell's Auto Works for the last time, his mother waiting in their car, no longer the old, damaged Toyota, but something newer that she'd bought herself with money she'd earned doing work she actually cared about. The sun was setting over the industrial district, painting the sky orange and purple above warehouses and shipping containers. Marcus looked back once at the building where he'd been mocked and ignored and dismissed. Then he got in the car. "Ready?" Diana asked. Marcus smiled. "Yeah, let's go home." And somewhere in the space between what engines are and what they could be, in the invisible realm where innovation lives before it becomes real, Raymond Williams' dream finally, permanently, unquestionably became truth. The boy who'd asked about water had shown the world what was possible, and the world, slowly but inevitably, was beginning to listen. So here's the real question. How many other brilliant minds have we dismissed simply because they asked questions we weren't ready to hear? If this story made you think differently about who deserves to be heard, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to stay silent when the world told them to disappear.